Hello, hello. Good evening to everyone. This is Todd Hill, president of Stonewall Democrats of Dallas, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. Welcome, everyone, to our June 2022 annual meeting. We're very happy to have you all join us this evening. We're going to get started here in just about another minute or two. We still have some folks trickling in through the waiting room, and so we'll wait just a couple of minutes, get started in earnest here in a second. But if you're a new member to Stonewall Democrats of Dallas, as I see some familiar names from folks that we signed up this month, either at Black Southern Pride this past weekend or the Pride Fest or festival from earlier in the month, I encourage you to put new member as your name or rename yourself, adding that so that folks know you're a new member to the organization, and or just raise your hand and say, hey, send a heart emoji, something of that nature. We're really, really thrilled that you all joined the organization and excited to have you for your first meeting here in June. Yeah, post in the chat if you're a new member. We're happy to welcome you, as will other members. So Madeline, welcome. All right, looks like we have a slow trickle now of folks joining in the waiting room. So we'll go ahead and get started at 6:32 p.m. and we will convene our general meeting for the month of June. Again, my name is Todd Hill. I'm president of Stonewall Democrats of Dallas, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. Thanks for being with us tonight. And we're very excited to kick off our agenda this evening with Luke Warford, who is Democratic candidate for Railroad Commission. Luke has been, traveling the state, talking about his campaign and how important it is to elect a Democrat to the Railroad Commission. So we're very excited to have Luke join us this evening. And so at this point, I am going to recognize Luke, and you can take it from here. And so we'll do about 10, 15 minutes maximum of comments from Luke, but folks here in the virtual audience, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of Luke. So if you want to post your question in the chat, our Vice President, Susie Hess, will help to moderate the questions that are coming through the chat room. So again, if you have a question for our guest speaker, Luke Warford, please post that in the chat, and Susie will ask the question to Luke. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Luke.
Thanks, Todd. And thank you, Susie, and the rest of y'all's executive team. I'm super excited to be here with the Stonewall Democrats of Dallas. I have heard incredible things about y'all's work and was excited to get the chance to speak with you. I hope next time, next time I'm in Dallas, I'll be sure to invite everyone out to whatever event we do. My name is Luke Warford. I am the Democratic nominee for a statewide position called the Texas Railroad Commission, which I imagine a lot of you are familiar with, but for the sake of clarity, it's worth reminding folks that it has nothing to do with the railroads anymore, that what the Texas Railroad Commission actually does is it regulates the Texas oil and gas industry. And that makes it truly one of the most important elected offices in the state from an economic perspective, because oil and gas is obviously huge here in Texas, from an environmental perspective, because Texas is the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the United States, and a huge amount of those emissions come out of the Texas oil and gas industry because the Texas Railroad Commission doesn't enforce the existing regulations. And it's also incredibly important from the perspective of our ability to keep the lights on, and last February's grid failure. And so I always do this in person, and it works sometimes over Zoom and sometimes not super well over Zoom. But for folks who have their cameras on, or you can drop it in the chat, as a show of hands, how many of y'all lost power during last February's winter storm, or no people who did? A bunch of folks, right? And this is also a little hard over Zoom, but if you want to put in the chat or come off mute and say what that was like, how was that? What was that experience like for you? Horrible, right? Thank you, Susan. I appreciate it. Same here, right? I live in Austin. It got down to 38 degrees inside my apartment. In the energy, in Texas, in the energy capital of the world in 2021. We didn't have power for 3 days. We were without water. We didn't, ran out of food. But honestly had it pretty good compared to a lot of people across the state, right? There were millions of people without power for days or more. There was billions of dollars in damages to our economy. And hundreds of Texans literally froze to death. And I think, as I have traveled around the state talking about this race, talking about why it matters and the issues at play, like that is the thing that I keep coming back to, because it really is just such an unconscionable and massive failing of our elected officials who are supposed to serve us and be public servants, that they let the grid fail, that it was preventable, and that hundreds of people literally froze to death. And so, I decided to run for this office, and I'll talk a little bit more about traveling around the state, but I mostly decided to go ahead and run for this office because I'm mad at the failings of our public servants, right? I was raised and grew up thinking that, people who take elected office are supposed to do what's best for the public, are supposed to be selfless and literally serve, right? And what we've got instead here in Texas, and you see this up and down the ballot, you see it in a lot of our statewide elected officials, is we've got Texas Republicans who time and time again are putting the interests of their donors, the interests of a small number of really wealthy business owners ahead of the interests of Texans across our state. And it's time and time again having massive, negative, sometimes deadly consequences for Texans. And we see that with Uvalde a few weeks ago. We saw that in the winter storm. And this is just a pattern of corruption and of conflicts of interest on the part of folks at the top of the ticket. So one of the things you get to do when you travel around the state, right, is you get to talk to people from all different places, right? I spend a lot of time in Dallas, but I've also been to, Houston and the Valley and West Texas and the tiniest towns you've ever heard of or never heard of, some of Texas's largest cities. And the things that I hear in those different places are relatively similar, right? Where people are worried about the grid failing again. They're worried about rising energy prices. And they're wondering why is it in the energy capital of the world that we're paying more for energy than our neighbors, right? Than people do in Louisiana or Oklahoma or Missouri or Arkansas, excuse me. And the thing that I think people often forget, and something that I think this group can play a really important role in doing, is just educating people about the role of the Texas Railroad Commission in some of these issues, right? Because, for example, we are all paying higher energy prices every single month right now because of the Texas Railroad Commission. Because during last year's winter storm, there was billions of dollars in profits made by Texas pipeline companies. Those profits or costs have then been passed along to Texans. And then every month, there's a surcharge on our bills. And there's issue after issue after issue where the Texas Railroad Commission is having an impact on people's lives. Just one really egregious example is there was a case that came out a few months ago where an oil and gas waste disposal company had applied for a permit to dispose of toxic oil and gas waste. It was on top of the Ogallala Aquifer, just north of Midland, which is an aquifer that gives 20 million people water. The Texas Railroad Commission staff evaluated that application, basically said, hey, this is too close to the aquifer. It's going to threaten local groundwater, and recommended against approving the permit. And the Texas Railroad Commission approved it anyway. And then 3 days later, the company that had applied for the permit donated $100,000 to the reelection campaign of Wayne Christian, the guy I'm running against. And so you see over and over and over again, just a pattern of these folks not doing their jobs, putting the interests of their donors ahead of the interests of Texans, and sacrificing these issues that are really important to the day-to-day lives of Texans, to public safety, to the energy prices, to things like that. I'm really excited to take questions. I want to talk a little bit about why I think we can actually win this race this cycle and sort of the broader context here, because I think it's important and it's one of the most common questions I get. So my background is mostly in energy. I have an economics degree and worked in energy consulting for a bunch of years, but I've also worked on political campaigns and most recently was at the Texas Democratic Party, where I met several folks on this call. I ran voter registration for the party. I helped recruit other candidates and run other folks' campaigns. And one of the reasons that I decided to run for the Texas Railroad Commission is I genuinely think that this is one of our best opportunities to win statewide this year and get what could be a critical foothold for Democrats in trying to make the state more representative and more democratic going forward. The reason I think that is because I genuinely believe the grid failure and the issues at play in this office are not or should not be super partisan, right? We have a message that is around keeping the lights on, lowering energy prices, and creating energy jobs. And that is popular when I say it in a room full of Democrats, but it's also popular when I say it in a room full of independents and Republicans. And so we know and we think, or we know that we have a popular message and a message that converts folks to want to vote for us and against our opponent. And the thing we need to do is we just need to be able to get that message out, right? And so that means raising money. That means you all telling your friends about this race and word of mouth and posting on the internet and doing all these different things. But I do genuinely think, we're 8 months in, and 8 months ago, we thought that there was a real path here. And I still think that that's true. And I think, what we've seen with the polling in the gubernatorial narrowing, what we've seen with other folks on the ticket, just, some of the strongest statewide candidates we've had in a long time. I'm incredibly excited and incredibly honored to be on the ticket along with the other folks who are running statewide this cycle. And just, really excited to be here. So thank you all for having me. I'm going to wrap up there and really excited to take questions and chat about whatever y'all are interested in.
All right. Susie, are you good, or do you need me to? I know you said your chat froze, so you're muted, dear. Okay. Well, I'm happy to step in and ask a couple of questions. We did have a couple come through the chat. Longtime SCDC committee woman and member Susan Bradley asked, is it true that we came within about 3 minutes of a total failure on our grid in 2021?
Yeah, it is. So we were at like 2 a.m. On Sunday night. It would have been, the Sunday night going into Monday. So I guess 2 a.m. Monday morning, things were so out of balance. And somebody who does a much better job explaining this than I do, there's a podcast called The Disconnect that has it's like a 4-part series that talks a lot about this. But basically the grid was so out of balance that we were about 3 minutes away from a failure that could have put like literally the entire state offline for weeks, right? And that obviously what happened last February was egregious and terrible, but it genuinely, we were close to it being worse. And I think the thing that's important to note here, right, is that it's been almost 1.5 years since last February's grid failure. And a lot of the issues that existed then still exist. Like a lot of the fundamental causes here have not been fixed. So one example is weatherization of our natural gas supply, right? So natural gas is the biggest thing we burn to make electricity here in Texas. One of the biggest, everybody talks about the quote unquote grid and you think like power plants and electrical wires. But the main cause or the root cause of the grid failure was actually a drop in natural gas supply because our natural gas producers were not prepared to operate in cold weather. And that's totally within the mandate of the Texas Railroad Commission. There were all of these expert recommendations going back to 2011 about how we needed to weatherize our natural gas infrastructure. And the Railroad Commission simply didn't do that. And that was one of the causes of the grid failure, which was preventable. But now it's been 18 months and they still haven't established a weatherization standard, right? And if they do establish a weatherization standard, I don't have confidence in them to enforce that standard, because their enforcement record on every other issue and every other law that they're supposed to enforce is pretty terrible. And so I think the point I would make here is that, like, there's still much more work to be done, right? Texas Republicans are trying to make the case or claim that things are fixed, and that's just not true, especially when it comes to some of the biggest and most fundamental challenges with the grid.
I know one question that I have, as I was looking and reading the news yesterday, I believe that was the highest demand upon our grid so far for the summer was yesterday. And obviously we've got triple digit temperatures that are continuing to, occur across the state of Texas. Are we gonna lose our grid at some point here? Because it feels like with that type of demand, and it's only June, and we still got July and August, which are the two hottest months in Texas. Should we be on pins and needles here?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. And just to put it in perspective a little bit, I think we set the demand record yesterday, and then I believe we were slated to set it again this afternoon. I actually haven't checked the numbers. I'll check right when we get off this, because I pay attention to this stuff. But we were set to set it again today. And that's within the context, like here in Austin, for example, we've already had 1,200-degree days this year, which is more 100-degree days than we had in all of 2021. And literally today is the first day of summer, right? And so one, I am personally worried, right? I'm worried about the demand that is on our grid. Two, I think when you look at what is keeping things healthy and going and online currently, we are depending a huge amount on renewables, on wind and solar in particular. And when you look at my opponent, who does everything he can to blame renewables for the grid failure and to say that they're bad and XYZ other reason, whereas like they're fundamentally a major they're playing a major role in increasing the reliability of our grid and its resilience, but also bringing prices down, right? Like if we didn't have that supply from renewables, Texans would be paying even more right now. And I think that's, something that's like, I'm worried about, and it's something that I hear about in every room, right? I think there's this like national conversation happening right now around energy prices. And everyone's trying to blame Joe Biden for it, but it's like Texas Republicans have been in, we're the energy capital of the world. We have more oil and gas, but also more wind and solar, than most other states or any other state. And so like, if you want to point fingers at somebody who's responsible for the situation we're currently in, it's the folks who have been in power for 30 years, who are dealt a phenomenal hand in terms of the types of energy resources we have, and they've just totally mismanaged it, right? And that's why you see them like anxiously pointing fingers everywhere, but not taking responsibility. It's because they know that they're to blame and their decisions are to blame, right? It's the passing the cost of the winter storm onto Texans, but I think it goes even beyond that, right? When you look at, one of the reasons that our electricity prices are high is because we're paying more for natural gas. Well, the reason natural gas prices are high right now is because of the monopolistic nature of the natural gas market and the fact that the Texas Railroad Commission defends and protects those monopolies, and there's no price transparency or competition. And so I just think there's a lot of different situations where, Texas Republicans are going to try to blame other folks, but it's really them who are responsible here.
Yes,
I'm back. I'm sorry, Todd. I can go ahead now.
All right, very well.
So Norma has asked, should we join the national grid? And we understand that is, that's something that was designed to supposedly make Texas more competitive by having our own separate grid, that it doesn't synchronize. Like we can't draw power in from Mexico or any of the other areas of the country. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I do think that makes sense. It's a thing that Beto's been talking. I'm sure folks have heard Beto talk about it a lot. for the sake of just like sort of jurisdictional clarity, that's not within the mandate of the Railroad Commission to actually connect to the rest of the grid. So when I think about, obviously from a like grid resilient standpoint, there's a lot of things to do on the supply side and on the demand side. A lot of the supply side issues, especially during the winter storm, were natural gas related and therefore like squarely within the mandate of the Railroad Commission. I do think like joining the national grid is not going to totally solve the problem, but I think that in combination with creating a weatherization standard, which is, I was talking about earlier, in combination with figuring out which natural gas producers are the most important to the system so they don't go offline when it gets cold, basically doing a supply chain map, which is also a Railroad Commission thing, is super important. And I think there's, obviously like our energy system is incredibly complex and touches on a huge part or varying parts of our state government, but also just like people's lives. And so I think there are probably like 20 things that need to be done at least to probably fix our grid. But some of the biggest ones are within the mandate of the Railroad Commission.
Great, thank you. So Daniel Melder asks, Atmos Energy's failed infrastructure is responsible for multiple home explosions across the state and at least one death in Dallas. Yet they pay a dividend to the shareholders annually. As a commissioner, what can you do or will you do to ensure that they spend that money where they should, investing back in the infrastructure?
Yeah, I think I want to look more at the specific case you're referring to, because I like know sort of at a high level about it, but I don't know the details and what caused this specific case. The thing that I would say is that like the current commission just doesn't even come close in terms of enforcing existing regulations and prioritizing public safety versus the profits of the oil and gas executives that run these companies, right? And so you see that time and time again where they're supposed to do an assessment of the impact on the local groundwater, or they're supposed to do an assessment of the impact on a local community, or they're supposed to regulate companies and hold them accountable. And just like time and time again, fail to do that effectively, fail to enforce the existing rules. I think from a causal perspective, and to talk a little bit about what I would do as commissioner, right? When you look at Wayne Christian, who's the guy the incumbent I'm running against, 70% of his campaign contributions come from the folks he's supposed to regulate, right? They come from the industry. And I think probably like 0.01% of my campaign contributions come from the oil and gas industry. Like maybe one person has donated to my campaign who's in the industry. And we're not taking contributions from oil and gas executives. We're not taking corporate PAC money. And the thing, because like that is just fundamentally wrong, right? It's fundamentally a conflict of interest to have the fox guarding the hen house, right? Where you've got your regulator who their campaigns are being paid for by the folks they're supposed to regulate. And so I think like the Atmos case you're talking about is, one example, but it's a pattern we see over and over again of them prioritizing, again, their donors over public safety or over the response, public service, right? Which is, what they're supposed to be doing.
Sure. So somebody comments that they lived in Arizona for a few years and 100+ degree days, April to November, didn't result in these problems, but completely different grid there and different. What can individuals here do? We understand that our solar panels, if the electrical grid is completely shut down, our solar panels do not work unless we have a battery backup.
Yeah.
Right. So what can individuals do in that regard? And know if it's if that's not one of your
No,
responsibilities.
but I love the question, right? I mean, I think I'll answer it because like I think about this on a daily basis, right? As just as a Texan, not even as somebody who's running for this office. I think there's a few things I would say, right? One is the Arizona point is spot on, right? I mean, similarly, the example I often use, right, is like it gets really cold in Wisconsin in the winter. Their grid doesn't fail. Their natural gas infrastructure doesn't go offline. It is a choice that we have made here in Texas to not have a weatherization requirement that requires natural gas producers to operate in cold weather. It's a choice that the Texas Railroad Commission made, and that is, one of the major things that led to the grid failing. In terms of individual things that we can do, I think one thing, like there's not enough of a conversation around individual conservation and around what we can do on the demand side. I think there's some interesting policy and some individual utilities where they have incentive programs to try to get people to use less electricity, but genuinely, like, this is a supply and demand thing, right? And so one of the levers we have is to try to lower our demand. And in terms of preparation, like I don't know, and this is like weird, but I get asked about this all the time. I am fortunate to be able to have like gone to a Walmart and a Target and stocked up with supplies to prepare for if the weather goes out, right? So like we have a bunch of water in our shed right now. We have a bunch of non-perishable meals. That's like not something that everyone can do, and that's like not an actual solution, right? You shouldn't have to. In Texas in 2021 or 2022 now, you shouldn't have to be worried about the grid failing and prepping for this worst case scenario. But what I've heard from folks across the state is they don't trust our government. They don't trust that things are going to be okay. And so folks are doing a lot of individual things like that to prepare as well.
So Omar Jimenez asked, how will you message to non-voters and others who might get their news from social media about how it's not the Democrats or Biden's fault? Like, we need education to let them know that high energy prices don't really track with the federal level at this point.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it touches on, so it's not lost on anyone on this call. I'm sure that I am slightly younger than your average statewide candidate. I'm 32. I'm the youngest Democrat to run statewide in more than 30 years. And I mean, a few things, right? One of the reasons I decided to run is because I think like the issues at play in this race really matter to young people, and having a young candidate run on issues that are really important to young people is important for this race from the perspective of engaging and exciting younger voters and getting them to turn out. It's important from the perspective of people being able to see themselves in the candidate, right? To relate to a candidate. I think it's also incredibly important for the rest of the ticket, right? Having a younger candidate, running around the state, prosecuting the case of the grid failure, talking about emissions and the impact of this race on the environment is going to help other candidates up and down the ballot, I think. In terms of what we're doing, so I spent a couple years working in media and sort of like in the social media space, and also ran, when I worked at the Texas Democratic Party, ran a bunch of our digital communications work. And so what we've really taken like content first, media first approach, both because it's the most effective thing to do, because we do so much of what we have to do is educate people. And so we're, constantly posting things on TikTok and on Twitter, and have TikTok videos with 100,000 views and Twitter videos with 300,000 views. And like that stuff is, it's a good way to reach different audiences. It's obviously not like the only thing that we're doing from a communication standpoint, but I think it's really important. And the fact that I'm a younger candidate means that I like understand those technologies and understand how to use them and connect with folks. And I think then the last thing I would say is just that, like, that paired with having the sort of resources and team. Like the other reason we do a lot of stuff on social media is because a lot of it is free, right? To some extent. And like for Texas is a huge state. I always joke that one of my biggest challenges is that we haven't figured out how to like be in 7 places at once. And Zoom is helpful with that, right? I could take this call from anywhere. But social media has been really effective in getting us to be able to connect with college students across the state, connect with different groups across the state in a way that I think like might not have been possible a few years ago.
Okay, I think we're going to take 2 more questions, and this is from a brand new member, Madeline Foster. So thank you, Madeline. What do you expect to be able to accomplish in a historically conservative railroad commission, and what are your plans if you are obstructed?
Yeah, Madeline, that's an amazing question. Thank you so much. And I thank you. I love doing events like this when people ask me questions that bring me to things I wanted to talk about but didn't talk about. It's like, and my campaign manager, I'm sure, is smiling right now, being like, "Oh yeah, I planted that question." So just as context for folks, the Railroad Commission is a 3-person commission. There are 6-year staggered terms, kind of like the Senate. So the question you might ask, so one commissioner is up this year, one commissioner is up in 2 years, and so on and so forth. And so if I were to win, I would be the minority on one person on a 3-person commission. And so this is a question I get a lot. It's like, oh, well, what can you actually do, right? And the thing is that an individual commissioner actually has a huge amount of power at the Texas Railroad Commission, because what currently happens is it's essentially a regulatory agency where companies apply for a permit. Railroad Commission staff, so there's like 800 staff that report to the 3 commissioners. Companies apply for a permit. The staff evaluate the permit, make a recommendation to the commissioners, and the commissioners vote at public meetings that are once every 2 weeks. And what currently happens is like 200 decisions, like everything gets passed on something called the consent agenda because nobody disagrees. And so basically what happens is the commissioners walk into a meeting, they say introducing items 1 through 268, everybody in favor, approved, and then they wrap the meeting. Like literally some of the meetings recently have been 9 minutes long. And so what no testimony, no public witnesses, no anything, right? No discussion and no transparency. And so what an individual commissioner can do is really like slow that process down and call on witnesses, call for testimony, call for hearings, all of this stuff, and really like slow down the process by which the commission can approve flaring exemptions, for example, which are a major cause of unnecessary methane and other greenhouse gas emissions. So you can have a huge effect in the first 2 years. And I would do that and then similarly like go on local news every night and just like scream about what the commission does and why it matters and how it's affecting people's lives, because a huge challenge here is that people are not, it's the education thing that I think somebody asked about earlier, that people just don't know what the commission does. And then obviously after those 2 years, I would also work like my butt off to try to get a second Democrat elected, because then, obviously 2 years in, we could get a second Democrat and then actually have majority on the commission. And I do think like, in terms of all of the folks I'm meeting and the support that we're building and the education we're doing around this race, this cycle, like is very much going to support the future people who run, whether or not we win or lose. I think that's the case. So thank you so much for asking that question.
All right, next up, Alyssa Webb. Do you want to unmute yourself, Alyssa?
Yes, hi. Hey, Luke, thank you so much for joining us. That was a really good free science lesson for those of us that are not science inclined. So I appreciate that. And thanks for being with us. I'm curious if your campaign plans during July include being in Dallas for the state Democratic Party convention.
100% they do. I
Oh,
can't
fantastic.
wait.
So I'm sure then you've already purchased your ticket for the Big D, which is Stonewall's big social for Texas Democrats Friday night at Sue Ellen's, the oldest lesbian bar in the state. You've already got your ticket, right, Luke?
That sounds like the best party in the city that night. And my campaign manager, Katie, who's on the line, I don't know if I genuinely don't know if I've purchased a ticket yet. Because one of the things so I'm a former campaign operative, right? And transitioning from being an operative to a candidate where I'm like, oh, I have to let somebody else control my life and my schedule. But I think you're inviting me, and I'm
Yeah, I'm volunteering you to join us. I think it's where you want to be Friday
Yep.
night, July 15th, starting at 9 p.m., Sue Ellen's. And we'll make sure that your campaign manager gets the details, and we'll be really excited to see you there and for you to join us.
Alyssa, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I thank you for making the choice about where we would have to go, would want to go that night, even easier.
So a couple of things. This is Todd. One, I've already passed along the information for the event to Katie, so she's got it. Number two, as you can tell, Alyssa is our fundraising chair, and she's amazing. She does a really great job. So we're really happy to have her. Final thing I just want to say is, Luke, I'm not sure if you have the vocals or not to be a country music singer, but you certainly have the name for it. So if that doesn't resonate with rural voters, I don't know what will. But nonetheless, we really thank you for being with us tonight. Really enjoyed hearing from you and about your campaign. We've posted your campaign website in the chat. You're welcome to hang around a little longer if you like, but I know you probably got a lot of other things that you may need to do, but feel free to hang out a little bit longer if you wish.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for having me. A lot of respect to anybody who's a good fundraiser. So respect you there. In that vein, our end of quarter, elected politicians always talk about fundraising deadlines and they all seem fake. But in this race, and I'm going to actually say this on behalf of all of our statewide candidates, in this race, there are reporting deadlines once every 6 months, not every month. And so our June 30th deadline actually is the most important one of the election. And so if there are candidates that you're thinking about supporting between now and November, donating by June 30th is great. If I'm one of those candidates, also great. I'm sure my website is in the chat, and we'll see you guys in Dallas in a few weeks.
All right, sounds good. And you'll be hearing from us too. We're going to be doing screenings of races in which we did not endorse candidates during the primary. And so that's one of your races, or your race is one of those. So we'll be in touch about information.